Masechta Beya, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. The first two parakim in this Masechta bring a bunch of machlekes in between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel regarding Yom Tov, and the first one pertains to an egg that was laid on Yom Tov. So Beitza should know to be Yom Tov. If the egg was laid on Yom Tov that fell on Sunday, Beis Shammai said that it may be eaten that day, even though the egg became complete, it fully developed the day before of Shabbos. Beis Hillel say that it may not be eaten that day, because it was prepared for Yom Tov on Shabbos. Beis Hillel learned from a pasuk that there's a halacha of hachana which requires that the food used in Yom Tov for Shabbos be prepared for that day on a Yom Chol, on a weekday, not on Shabbos Yom Tov. Therefore, if any food item was prepared on Shabbos for Yom Tov that occurs the following day, that item lacks the hachana needed to make it usable the Yom Tov day. It is therefore asur on that Yom Tov. This hachana requirement is relevant in the case of an egg, because an egg becomes fully developed within the hen on the day before it's laid. So if an egg is laid on Yom Tov that falls on Sunday, the egg became fully developed, or muchan, on the day before, which was Shabbos, and not on a regular day, not on a weekday, not on a Yom Chol. So Beis Hillel paskin that the egg is osur, the beya is osur, because it doesn't have proper hachana. Even though this hachana does not involve any malacha, definitely not a malacha d'oraisa, and it happened on its own, nevertheless it didn't take place on an ordinary weekday, so the beitza, the beya, may not be eaten on that Yom Tov. Moreover, Beis Hillel hold that an egg is also not only if it is laid on Yom Tov, it falls on Sunday, but even if it's laid on Yom Tov, that falls on a weekday, even though there is no problem of hachana. The Chachamim were concerned that if an egg were mutter on Yom Tov that falls on any weekday, people would mistakenly permit it on Sunday as well. They therefore asked it on every Yom Tov, no matter what day of the week it falls. Nevertheless, the Mishnah speaks of the main case in this halacha, which is the egg which was laid on Sunday. Beis Shammai, on the other hand, do not learn from the pasuk that hachana is a requirement, and therefore are matter an egg that is laid on Yom Tov. The next machlekes in the Mishnah regards Yom Tov of Pesach. On Pesach, a person is also to eat or even own chametz, or sourdough, which is dough that had fermented to the point that it can cause other doughs to rise. As the pasuk says, "V'lo yirah lecha chametz, v'lo yirah lecha sa'ar b'chol gvulecha." Chametz shall not be seen, and sourdough shall not be seen in all your borders. This pasuk answers only chametz and sourdough on Pesach, as we discussed by Arichos at great length in Masechta Pesachim. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagree about the minimum amount of these substances that a person is also to own on Pesach. Beis Shammai says kazayis. The smallest amount of sourdough that the Torah asks a person to own on Pesach is the size of an olive. Chametz b'koseves. And the smallest amount of chametz that the Torah asks a person to own on Pesach is a volume of a date, which is larger than an olive. Beis Shammai hold that if the amount of sourdough and chametz is aser would be the same, the Torah would have said le'irah lecha chametz v'sa'ar, or the Torah wouldn't say sa'ar at all. There's no need to mention sa'ar because it's simply a stronger form of chametz. Why then does the Torah mention sa'ar? To teach that the amount of sourdough one may not own is different from the amount of chametz one may not own. Therefore, since sa'ar is stronger than regular chametz, it's aser in the smaller amount of a shir of a kezayis, whereas regular chametz is aser in the larger amount of a kakoseves, the size of a date. Beis Hillel says this and that. The smallest amounts of sourdough and chametz that the Torah asks a person to own on Pesach are both the size of a kezayis. Beis Hillel hold that the smallest amount of chametz and sa'ar the Torah asks is derived from the smallest amount of chametz and sourdough one may not eat, which everyone agrees is the shir of a kezayis. Midrabban, however, it's aser even mamashahu. The machlekes b'chametz, which obviously is exclusive to the Yom Tov of Pesach, is included here with the halachas that apply to every Yom Tov, because it's one of the three machlekes in about Yom Tov, two in this Mishnah, one in the next, in which Beis Shammai's ruling is uncharacteristically more lenient than Beis Hillel, which is always interesting when we see that. Mishnah Beis. Hashreichet chayev ha'oif b'Yom Tov, Beis Shammai emim yach b'badeker v'yichase, Beis Hillel emim le'yishchet elam kein ha'oilei ofar kira muchan m'boydar. The Mishnah deals with halacha with the mitzvah of kisui hadam. The Torah says that after one shechts a non-domestic animal, any one of the 7 chayes that are kosher, or a bird, one must cover the blood with earth, sand, or similar substance, as the Mishnah in Chulin and Perek Vav speaks out. Therefore, if one wishes to shech such an animal or bird on Yom Tov for meat, he must be able to cover its blood. Preparing earth on Yom Tov or using it for this mitzvah can involve the malachas of plowing, which would be digging up earth from the ground or grinding, crumbling clods of earth to make them loose and fit to spread, as well as the Isser of Muktzah, if the earth wasn't prepared before Yom Tov. So the Mishnah discusses how this mitzvah may be done on Yom Tov. The Torah says, Asher yotzu tzeit chaya oy oif, asher yeyochel v'shofach hastama v'chisoa ba'afar. He who traps a non-domestic animal or bird that may be eaten shall spill its blood, meaning shechted, and cover it with earth. The mitzvah applies only to non-domestic animals, to chayas and to birds, and not domestic animals such as cattle, sheep, and goats. When you shech the bird, when you shech chickens, you have a mitzvah of kisei adam. It's very interesting. We don't necessarily see that, but that happens. So, hashechet chay va'if b'yam tov. If a person wants to shech a non-domestic animal or bird on Yom Tov, but doesn't have the earth prepared to cover the dam, to do kisei adam, so Beishamei Oimrim Yachbar Badeka V'Yechasa, he may shech the animal, dig up earth with a shovel, and use it to cover the blood. However, if earth cannot be obtained except by doing a malach or moving muktzah, Beishamei agree that one may not shech these animals on Yom Tov. However, this is mutter only if the earth is loose and the shovel was inserted into it before Yom Tov. Since the earth is loose, removing it from the ground doesn't create a permanent hole, so this is not considered plowing midiraisa, and since the shovel was already in the ground, it's not plowing even midirabbonon. The fact that the earth is loose also eliminates the problem of teichen, of grinding, because there's no need to grind loose earth. Finally, the earth is not muktzah because the insertion of the shovel into the ground before Yom Tov makes it mucha. Beis Hillel and Beis Hillel say, he may not shech the animal unless he has earth completely prepared from the previous day. It doesn't suffice to have loose earth into which a shovel is inserted, because clods of earth that require grinding might still come up. Rather, the earth must be completely prepared beforehand, dug up, crumbled, and designated. However, Beis Hillel agreed to Beis Shammai that if he went against the halacha and shechted an animal on Yom Tov without being mechen the earth for kisei adam, he may dig up earth with a shovel and use it to cover the blood. He may use soft earth into which a shovel has already been inserted before Yom Tov, as Beis Shammai paskin in the case of one who wants to shecht the animal on Yom Tov lechatchila. Although Beis Hillel asks shechting chayes and oifes unless he prepared earth on Yom Tov, if one nevertheless goes ahead and shech such an animal and becomes mechuyev in kisei adam, he may be seimich on Beis Shammai's solution to dig up soft earth, which avoids the iser, the raisa of chayresh and teichin with a shovel that had been thrust into the ground before Yom Tov, which avoids the iser drabanan of chayresh and any muktzah problems. She'efa kira muchanu. The Mishnah cites a case in which Beis Hillel agreed that a person may shech a non-domestic animal or bird in the first place, even if he does not have earth prepared before Yom Tov. If ashes, which may also be used for kisei adam, were left in a stove before Yom Tov began, a person may shech a non-domestic animal or bird on Yom Tov and use the ashes to cover the blood, because the ashes of a stove are considered muchan, are considered prepared for this use, even if he didn't set them aside specifically for this purpose. Since a person knows before Yom Tov that he can use the ashes in the stove for the mitzvah, they're not considered muktzah. However, if the ashes were formed on Yom Tov, then in most cases they will be muktzah. Mishnah Gimel. Beis Shammai Oimrim ein melichin es hasulam mishoivach l'shoivach. The Mishnah discusses whether a person may move a ladder in Yom Tov to take doves from a birdhouse. The dovecote is an outdoor birdhouse situated on top of a pole and containing many compartments. Passing doves come and nest in it, and they're sometimes taken and eaten. So a person may not move a ladder from a birdhouse to another on Yom Tov because he gives the impression that he's taking the ladder to fix his roof, which would be asur on Yom Tov. People who see someone moving a ladder on Yom Tov may suspect him of taking it to fix his roof, which is asur on Yom Tov because of the malacha of boina. The Chachamim therefore asur moving a ladder from one shoivach to another because it gives the appearance of wrongdoing, which is marazayin, which is a problem. According to Beis Shammai, this isur applies not only in public, but even in a completely private area where no one will see him. This follows the general rule that anything that the Chachamim asur because of marazayin, afilu b'chadrei chadarim asur, is prohibited even in the privacy of one's home. Actually, Beis Shammai asur moving a ladder in Yom Tov in any situation where suspicion would be aroused. The Mishnah mentions moving a ladder to take yonim from a shoivach because it's the only case mutter that are mutter according to Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai asur this even in private where no one sees him. However, he may tilt the ladder from one window of the shoivach to another window of the same shoivach, because in this case it's clear that he's not using the ladder for something that's asur. A single shoivach has many separate compartments, each with its own opening through which the birds go in and out. If one doesn't take a ladder away from the shevach, simply tilts it from one of these windows to another, it's clear that he's moving it only to reach the doves, which is mutter. Tilting the ladder in this way is mutter, even if it's going to be in public, since it doesn't arouse suspicion, because they know that you're just moving it from one spot to another in the same shevach. Beis matirim, Beis permit him to move a ladder even from one shevach to another in private, where nobody sees him. Beis agree that moving the ladder in public is also because of maras ayin, and that anything that the chachamim answer from maras ayin, afilu b'chadrei chadarim also, even in the privacy of one's home, is also. Nevertheless, Beis argued that the chachamim made an exception in this case, where the person is using the ladder to take the doves to eat, which would add to his enjoyment of Yantif. Even according to Beis however, this may be done only in private. The Mishnah deals with a small type of ladder that's clearly meant for use with shevachos. Moving even such a ladder can sometimes arouse suspicion, so Beis Shammai forbid doing so in private, and Beis Hillel forbid it at least in public. However, if the ladder is a larger type that's clearly intended for house repairs, everyone agrees that it may not be moved even in private. The birds in the shevach are muktzah, because they often wander away and cannot be counted on to be there in Yantif. The Mishnah deals with young doves that cannot yet fly, in which case there's no isser of tzad when he takes them on Yantif. However, even these can hop away and are therefore muktzah. So, a person may take them on Yantif to shech them and eat them, only if their muktzah status had been removed by preparing them before Yantif. Now, if they fly away, so then he wasn't making them before Yantif, he was making them if they flew away, so it doesn't help him. So, Beis Shammai say liyitel elam kein nena mib'oid yoim. A person may not take doves from a shevach and Yantif unless he has shaken them while it was still there before Yantif began, and thereby removed their muktzah status. If a person merely says that he plans to take these doves and doesn't shake them, there's concern that when he handles them, feels them in Yantif, he might decide to spare them. He wouldn't shake them and eat them. If so, he will have handled birds in Yantif for no reason, which is usher because there's no need for it. Beis Shammai therefore require that he shake them before Yantif, after which he's not likely to change his mind. Doesn't mean to shake them around, it just means to pick them up. Chayra just means to pick them up. Beis Hillel say, even if he stands before Yantif and he says, I'll take this one and that one, he removes the muktzah status and there's no need for him to shake them. Beis Hillel hold that even if he didn't touch them beforehand, we're not concerned that he might decide later to change his mind. The Gemara and not use them. The Gemara Davyud explains that this machlekes concerns only the first two doves that were hatched in the shevach for that season. The two doves are usually left in the shevach to keep their mother's company. So even after saying that he will take them, a person might well change his mind and leave them there. For this reason, Beis Shammai paskin that he must shake them before Yom Tov, because the doves that hatched after the first two, everyone's maskim hakol moedim that it suffices to say that he will take them, because the shteiger zalos rishonos, they don't go anywhere. They don't leave the mother. And this also we know this from Mishnah of Basra as well. Okay, Mishnah Dalet. Zimein shchorim u'matzah levanim, levanim u'matzah shchorim, shnayim u'matzah shloisha asurim. The previous Mishnah taught that a person may not take doves from a shevach and Yantiv unless he had removed their muktzah status before Yantiv. So the following Mishnah deals with one who prepared certain doves before Yantiv, but when he came to take them in Yantiv, he can't tell whether the doves he finds at the time are the ones that he had prepared or they were different ones. Zimein shchorim u'matzah levanim. If one prepared black doves in a particular compartment in the shevach before Yantiv, but he came on Yantiv and found only white ones in that compartment, or the other way around, if you prepared white ones in a particular compartment of the shevach, but Yantiv found only black ones there, or if he prepared only two doves that were in a particular part of the shevach, but Yantiv he found three there, so one of the doves was certainly not prepared, but he can't tell which one it is, asurim. In each of these cases, the doves that he found are awesome because they might not be the ones that he was making. In the first two cases where he prepared black doves and found white ones, or vice versa, the doves that he found are certainly not the ones he had prepared. The Gemara says that this is too obvious for the Mishnah to bother mentioning, therefore the Mishnah must mean something else. In fact, the first two cases are one. Before Yom Tov, a person prepared black doves and white doves. The black ones were in one compartment and the white ones were in another. In Yom Tov, he found white doves in the compartment where he prepared the black ones, and the black doves in the compartment where he prepared the white ones. Now, there are two ways to explain this change. Either the black ones and the white ones simply switched compartments, or all the prepared doves had left both of the compartments, and other doves which had not prepared at all had taken their places. If the doves that he was making had just switched compartments, they would all be mutter. But if the doves that he found were from elsewhere, they would all be usher. The Mishnah paskins that they're all Also, because the second possibility that the prepared doves left and were replaced by ones that are Einim Min HaMuchan is more likely than the first dove switched compartments. In the Mishnah's third case, where he prepared 2 doves and found 3, the problem is that one of the doves is certainly Asr and can't tell which one it is. Therefore, each one of them is Asr because it might be the one that was Asr. The MS is that there are situations where we say that if a single prohibited item is mixed with 2 or more, then it becomes permitted. The single item loses its separate identity and becomes permitted like the other ones. However, we don't apply this rule to living beings such as doves because each one is too significant to lose its separate identity. Each one's a beria, so we can't say we can't just be mevatel like that. Shloisho matar shnayim mutarim. However, if you prepare 3 on Yantif, meaning if you prepare 3 for Yantif and found only 2, they're mutar because they're presumably 2 of the doves that he prepared, and we assume that 1 left and the other 2 remained. If he prepared doves that were inside one of the compartments, but on Yantif found doves only on the ledge in front of the compartments with none inside it, asurim, they're also because they may not be the ones that you prepared. Either the prepared doves stepped out to the ledge in front of the compartment, or they had left the compartment altogether, and other doves that are not Min HaMuchan are now on the ledge. The second possibility is more likely, and therefore the found doves are Asr v'mein sham elahem arei elu mutarim. However, if there were no doves in the entire Shevach before Yom Tov except the ones that he prepared, and on Yom Tov he found doves only in front of the compartment and none inside, harei elu mutarim, they are mutar because they're presumably the ones that he prepared. Since there were no other doves in the Shevach, we may assume that these are the ones he prepared and that they had come out to rest on the ledge. The Mishnah refers to doves that cannot fly, rather they hop from one place to another like we mentioned earlier. In the case of doves that can fly, if the doves he finds are not in the place where he prepared them, they're always Asr because of the strong possibility that they are other unprepared doves that flew into the Shevach from Epis elsewhere. Mishnah Hey. The Mishnah cites 4 more machlekes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel that concern Yom Tov. The first regards a vendor's booth. A vendor would set up a portable booth in the marketplace, remove the door, and prop up the door as a shelf to display his wares. When he was finished for the day, he would put the door back in place to keep the booth closed when he's not using it. So Beis Shammai say, Ein mesalkin es hatrisin b'yantiv. A vendor may not detach the door from his booth on Yantiv because that resembles the malacha of Soiser. According to Beis Shammai, detaching the door from the booth is also midrabanan because it resembles the malacha of Soiser. Putting the door back in place would also be also because of the malacha of Baina. It's not actual building because the booth is not attached to the ground. The doors of these booths are not held in place by a pivot, but by a type of peg that doesn't allow them to be opened except by removing the door. Therefore, inserting this peg is not an actual building. Beis Hillel matir and af laharzer, but Beis Hillel matir him not only to detach the door so he can sell items that it will add to Simchas Yom Tov. It's permitted to buy and sell food items on Yom Tov if you have certain conditions, which is, we don't think about it like that because we know we don't go to the store on Yom Tov, but in the times of the Mishnah, maybe they did. But also to put it back in place after he had finished selling for the day. If he's not allowed to put the door back, he might not want to detach it in the first place, because he will then have to leave the booth open the entire day. Therefore, to encourage him to open his booth and sell goods that will increase Simchas Yom Tov, the Chacham allowed him not only to detach the door in the first place, but to even put it back. A second machlekes in the Mishnah, Beis Shammai say, Ein neitlin es ha'eli lekativ elav basar. A person not take a large pestle, which resembles a thick, heavy board to chop meat on it, because it's muktzah. This is not an ordinary eli, such as one that's used to crush powder in a mortar, but a large beam that's used to crush grain. So Beis Shammai paskin that it may not be used as a chopping board for meat because it's muktzah. Since this type of beam is expensive, the owner doesn't allow it to be used for anything besides for its regular use, for fear that it will be ruined and he will lose a valuable item. As such, it's considered muktzah machmas chesaron kis, muktzah because of a concern of a monetary loss, as we discussed in the Akdama to the Masechta. Beis Hillel matirin, but Beis Hillel permit a person to take such a board so he can use it to prepare food that will be eaten in Yom Tov. According to Beis Hillel, the muktzah prohibition was lifted in this case for the sake of Simchas Yom Tov. The third machlokes in the Mishnah, Beis Shammai say, Ein noisen es ha'or lifnei hadorsan. After a person shechs the animal in Yom Tov, He may not put the hide in front of people who will trample it, which prevents it from decaying, because that's linked to the malacha of me'abed, tanning. Trampling hides is the first step in the process of tanning, making hides into leather. Beishamai therefore asks a person to put a hide in place where it'll be trampled, because it looks as if he were about to tan the hide on Yantiv, which would be a malacha that is aser. And because the hide is muktzah, he may not even pick it up unless it has the shir v'kizayis of meat attached to it. A fresh hide which is still moist cannot be used for anything, so it's muktzah and may not be moved on Yantiv or Shabbos. However, if there's a kizayis of meat that's still attached to the hide, it's not muktzah on Yantiv because the meat may be cooked and eaten. The presence of some meat on the hide removes only the isser of muktzah. Even such a hide may not be put in place where it will be trampled, because trampling is part of the malacha of ma'abed, which is the part of the tanning process. Ubesil and matir and besil are matir, both activities, because if a person is not allowed to prevent the animal's hide from decaying, so then he will not want to shech the animal in the first place, and there will be less meat to eat on Yantif, and we want people to have what they need to eat, be able to eat on Yantif. The fourth machlekes is Beishamai Emrim Ein Meitziin Loyas Hakoton V'Loyas Halulav V'Loyas HaSefer Torah L'Rishus Harab. You may not carry a child, a lulav, or a sefer Torah into Rishus Harab on Yantif, because this would be the Isser Deraisa of carrying on Yantif, which is Asr on Yantif, for purposes other than preparing food. The Torah asks on Yantif all the 39 malachas that may not be done on Shabbos, except when one needs to do a malacha for preparing food for Echel Nefesh. For example, although carrying things in the street is malacha, a person is mutter in Yantif to carry food and items needed to prepare food. By Shammai say that it's also to carry anything else, such as the items listed in the Mishnah. Even a lulav you can't carry on Yantif, so that would get rid of a lot of the discussions that we had in Masechta Sukkah about carrying the lulav in the Rishus Harab. Besil matirin, but Besil are matir carrying these items in the street, because they maintain that any malacha permitted for the sake of Echel Nefesh is going to be mutter for other things as well. This halacha is known as mitech shehutra l'tzarech hutra nami shalei l'tzarech. Since this malacha was permitted on Yom Tov for food-related needs, it was permitted for non-food Yom Tov needs as well. Since one is allowed to transfer objects that are needed for food preparation, one may also transfer these other items. Mishnah Vav. Beishamai say ein melichin chalu umatanos lakoyin b'Yom Tov ben shehum u'me'emesh ben shehum u'me'ayoyim. The Mishnah discusses challah, the portion of a kneaded dough that must be given to a kohen, and matanis, which is part of an animal that shechted, must be given to a kohen. Specifically, the matanis are the zreya, the chayayim, the keva, the right foreleg, the jaws, and the muah, which is one of the stomachs. After shechting an ordinary animal that's not a carbon, one must remove these parts and give them to a kohen. On Yom Tov, it's mutter to be mafresh challah from a dough, and matanis from an animal that you shechted. The Mishnah brings a machlekes as to whether challah and matanis that you already separated may be given to a kohen in Yom Tov. So, Beishamai say, ein melichin challah matanis kohen b'Yom Tov. You may not bring challah or matanis to a kohen in Yom Tov. Ben shehum u'me'emesh, ben shehum u'me'ayom. Whether they were separated the day before Yom Tov and could have been given to them, or whether they were separated on Yom Tov and cannot have been given to them beforehand. Either way, we may not give them to a kohen in Yom Tov. Besil matirin. And Beis permit a person to give challah matanos to a kohen in Yom Tov in all cases, even if he could have given them the previous day. Amar lahem Beishamai. Beishamai said to Beis Hillel, Gzeir Shava. A ruling is based on a Gzeir Shava. The term Gzeir Shava usually refers to the method of one of the Yud Gimel Midas Shater Dreshes Beham that links two psukim that contain the same words. Here, however, it's used as a borrowed sense to mean comparison, because we're not talking about psukim. We're just trying to compare and contrast something. So chalu matana is matana l'koyin. With truma matana l'koyin. Shem she'in melichin as a truma, kach ein melichin as a matanis. So Beishamai say to them like this: Chala and matanis are matnas kahuna, and truma is also one of the matnas kahuna. So since they're alike in this way, the halacha should be the same thing. And geshem she'in melichin as a truma. Therefore, just as one may not bring truma to a kohen in Yom Tov, kach ein melichin as a matanis. So too, one may not bring the matanis of challah and other matnas kahuna to a kohen in Yom Tov. But Beis Hillel responded like this: Armelan Beis Hillel said to Beishamai, "Loy, no, we're not asking to this idea. Im amartem truma she'en lezaka ba'aramasa. Even if you say about truma, the one may not bring it to a kohen in Yom Tov. That is only because one is not permitted to separate it on Yom Tov. but only before Yantif, when one is mechuyev, when the chiyuv of truma takes effect, when the chiyuv to be mafresh truma takes effect, one doesn't become mechuyev to separate truma until the final stages of processing the produce have been completed. In the case of grain, these include threshing the stalks to remove the kernels, or heaping the kernels into a pile and smoothing out the pile. So activities of this type are typically done before Yantif, because they're asr on Yantif. In the standard course of events, therefore, the chiyuv to separate truma takes effect before Yantif. So since the chiyuv to separate truma takes effect, it must be fulfilled before Yantif. So the chiyuv to bring truma or a kain must also be fulfilled and not after Yantif starts. The Torah asers eating produce from which truma has not yet been separated. That's called teva. So the act of separating truma makes the produce fit to be eaten. Separating truma resembles the malacha deraisa of makbeh patish, masak and mano, which makes the utensil fit to be used. Given this resemblance, the chacham asks separating truma and yantif. Furthermore, they asked giving truma to a kain and yantif, because if giving truma was mutter, then people might mistakenly assume that even being mafresh truma is mutter. Had it been impossible to separate truma before yantif, the chachamim would have lifted the isser of separating truma so that people could eat the produce in yantif. However, since it is possible to separate the truma before yantif, the isser of separating truma was left in place. So, how then can you say that truma is comparable to challah and matanas, which one is permitted to separate in yantif? The chiyuv to separate challah and matanas does take effect on yantif and may thus be fulfilled then. Meaning you could be mekayim the mitzvah then. Therefore, it's only mutter to bring them to a kayin. Therefore, it's also mutter to bring them to a kayin on yantif. One's allowed to wait until yantif to eat them and shecht animals, so they'll have fresh bread and meat to eat on yantif. I mean, this is really, you see how Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are going l'shitasim throughout, right? That this idea of shechting animal on yantif would be mutter. So then, for truma purposes, it's also going to be mutter. In this case, at least, it's impossible to have separated the challah and matanos before yantif, because the chiyuv to separate them doesn't take effect until the dough is kneaded and until the animal is shechted. So for this reason, the chachamim were matir separating them, being mafresh them on yantif. Since they're first separated on yantif, they may also be given to a kain on yantif. Once the chachamim were matir giving challah and matanos in one case, they didn't impose the isser against giving them in any case. So giving challah and matanos to a kain on yantif is always mutter, even if they had already been separated the day before and could have been given then. Shammai, however, take the opposite position. Their shita is giving challah and matanos to a kain on yantif is always aser, even if the dough was kneaded and the animal was shechted on yantif, in which case separating challah and matanos is mutter, giving them is aser. They were concerned that if people were to see challah and matanos being brought to a kain on yantif, they might mistakenly think that separating them on yantif is mutter in all cases, even where they could have been separated the day before. Mishnah Zayin. What are we talking about over here? The malacha of teichin is basically forbidden on yantif. For example, it's forbidden to grind grain. One is nevertheless permitted to grind spices and salt. Salt that has been mined in large pieces must be crushed in order to make it usable, because there are types of food that are commonly crushed only in small amounts to prepare for a meal. However, since teichin is generally aser, there might be reason to aser grinding even spices and salt in the usual way. The Mishnah brings the machlekes about if you need to do it with a shinui. So spices may be ground in yantif only with a pestle of wood and not with the usual pestle of stone. Spices are typically ground with a modoich in a medoicha. The medoicha is the bowl. Since grinding is generally forbidden on yantif, by Shammai paskin that even when it's allowed in the case of spices, a change in procedure is necessary. Instead of using the usual stone, one must use a wooden one, and then he'll ask himself, why is he using the wooden one? Oh, it's yantif, I can't do it the regular way. Clumps of salt, which could have been ground before yantif without losing any flavor, may be ground on yantif only with an earthenware flask or a wooden mixing spoon, and not with any kind of pestle. Since salt can be ground long before it's used without losing any flavor, a person should grind the salt that he will need on yantif beforehand. However, if he didn't, although he's allowed to grind it on yantif, Beis Shammai may require a significant change in procedure. Using any kind of pestle would be aser. Instead, one must grind with an earthenware flask or a spoon. Beis Hillel say, Tavla nideichen kedarkon b'modach shel even, b'melach b'modach shel eitz. Spices may be ground in yantif in the usual manner, with a pestle of stone, and clumps of salt may be ground in yantif with a pestle of wood, though not with a pestle of stone. One is not expected to grind spices before yantif since it loses their flavor. Since the flavor would diminish by the time they are used, therefore Beis Hillel rule, and no change at all is necessary in the case of spices. Salt, which doesn't change, so then that's different. Mishnah Ches. Habayr kitnis biyantif, Beishamai Oimrim Bayr Oichel v'Oichel, Beis Hillel Oimrim Bayr kedarka becheka bekana betamchoy. Let's see. The malacha of bayr is separating waste from food or any unwanted items from wanted items. Meaning, you have a tomato cucumber salad and you don't like tomatoes, so you start picking out the tomatoes. You're not allowed to do that. So Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagree about the halachas of doing bayr on yantif. So habayr kitnis biyantif. If one wants to select kitnis, such as beans or peas from the shells, husks, or other wastes on yantif, Beis Shammai say bayr oichel v'oichel. He must select the edible food from the waste with his hand and eat it right away. According to Beis Shammai, the malacha of bayr is forbidden in yantif. Therefore, there matter only this method, which is not considered bayr at all. Even on Shabbos, bayr is mutter if it meets all three of the following conditions. One, the person takes the oichel mitecha psailas and not the psailas mitecha oichel. The person takes the food from the waste and not the other way around. B, he uses his hands, not a kli. C, he intends to eat it right away. Therefore, even though Beis Shammai hold up bayr is asur and yantiv, they allow a person to remove kitnis from their shells with his hand to eat it right away. Beis Hillel say that doing bayr for kitnis is mutter and yantiv. Bayr kedarkoi, one may select them in the usual manner, bechekoi, by putting the mixture in a sheet on his lap by tilting the sheet so that the round beans roll away from the waste, bekonon, or by pouring the mixture through a funnel so that the beans which are smaller than the waste fall through the narrow end of the funnel, ubetamchui, or by putting the mixture onto a plate and gently shaking it so that the round beans fall off. Beis Hillel hold that since being bayr, the husks from the psailas from the oichel is done on the day it's eaten, it's mutter on yantiv. Therefore, when selecting them on yantiv, when doing bayr on these beans on yantiv, it's not necessary to meet these three conditions listed previously. Rather, one's allowed to take the waste from the food using a tool with intent to eat the food later in the day. In the following cases, however, even Beis Hillel asur doing bayr on yantiv. One may not place the mixture onto a large board and gently tilt the board so that the beans fall off, strain the mixture in a fine strainer which has small holes in its netting, or in a coarse strainer whose holes are larger. Right? A nafa is a sifter and a kvar is a sieve. That's always how we touched it. A nafa has smaller holes and a kvar has bigger holes. A large board and a strainer are used for selecting large quantities. Hence, even Beis Hillel asks a person to use them in yantiv because it appears as if he is selecting food to be eaten after yantiv, which is asur. Gamliel Omer, af meidiach v'shayla. One may even put a mixture of beans and waste in a bowl, pour water on the mixture, causing the waste, which is lighter, to float to the top, and then skim off the waste. Although this method of bayr was usually used for large quantities, which is the way that it's done on weekdays, Gamliel permits it for small quantities that will be eaten on yantiv. Mishnah Tes. Beis Shammai Oimrim, ein meshalchen beyantiv ela monos. Beis Hillel Oimrim, meshalchen behema, chayav oiv, ben chayim, ben shchutim. Beis Shammai say we may not send gifts to a friend on yantiv except portions of food that are ready to be eaten as they are without any further preparation. Sending anything that requires preparation is awesome because the person receiving it is likely to set it aside to be prepared and eaten after yantiv. So sending it will have expended effort on something that doesn't serve a purpose on yantiv. But Beis Hillel say no. Beis Hillel say you may even send domestic birds, domestic animals, or non-domestic animals, chayis, oifis, or behemis, chayim, ben shchutim, whether alive or already shechted. Although they require preparation before they can be eaten. A shechted animal must be cooked, and live animals must be shechted. However, these are eichel nefesh malachas that are mutter and yantif. Right? This is all going to go back to the fundamental machlekes, but Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel hold what you're allowed to do in yantif and what not. So meshalchin yenis shmanim uslatzes kitniyas. We may also send wine, oil, flour, and beans. Beis Hillel do not consider it a problem that the recipient will set aside these items to be prepared and eaten after yantiv. Since it's possible to prepare and eat them on yantiv, one's allowed to send them. Wine and oil have no hachana whatsoever. Flour may be eaten after it's kneaded and baked, which malachas are mutter to do in yantiv. And kinias may be eaten after they were cooked, which is also mutter on Yantif. According to Beis Hillel, it doesn't matter whether or not the recipient is likely to eat a gift on Yantif, as long as it can be eaten on Yantif when consented. The reason that the very act of sending a matana increases one's joy, enhancing the celebration of Yantif. It enhances the Simchas Yantif. Avaloi Tvua. However, Beis Hillel agreed that one may not send raw grain because it may be ground into flour before it can be used, and Teichen is Asur on Yantif. Reb Shimon Matir B'Tvua, Reb Shimon's Matir sending even raw grain on Yantif because it can be cooked and eaten without being ground. As mentioned, Beis Hillel disagree with Reb Shimon because grain is usually ground into flour, which is something that's Asur on Yantif. Mishnah Yud. Mishalchin Kelim Bein Tfurim Bein She'enin Tfurim. We may send clothing whether there are pieces of material that are sewn together and can be worn as a garment, or pieces of material that are not yet sewn together and can be used only as covers. Sending these items as mutter, even if they contain a mixture of wool and linen, they are shatnas which may not be worn as clothing or even used as a cover. The Torah says that it's also for a person to wear or cover himself with clothing that contains shatnas, which is a combination of wool and linen, which we discussed in the last parak of Masechta Klayim. However, this is true only if the item is made of stiff material that provides no warmth. So sitting or lying on it is not usher from hilchas shatnez. Wearing or covering oneself with the cloth of shatnez is usher only if it makes one warmer. All these articles may be sent as gifts because they're fit to serve as a yantif need, because finished clothes can be worn in yantif. Unfinished clothes can be used as covers, and stiff shatnez material can be used to lie on or to sit on. So, however, he may not send nailed sandals because wearing them is forbidden on yantif, as we spoke in Masechta Shabbos. The Chachamim asked wearing these shoes on Shabbos or yantif because of a Ma'aser Shehaya. A group of people wearing such sandals once gathered in a cave to hide from the enemies, and when they heard noises from above, they panicked, fearing that they had been discovered and ran to escape. In the stampede that followed, many were killed because of the nails in the sandals. To prevent similar tragedies, the Chachamim were mazaken that these shoes are also to wear on days when people gather together, like Shabbos or Yom Tov. And you also may not send shoes whose leather pieces are not yet stitched together, because they're not wearable. Even if the pieces are temporarily attached by small wooden pegs, the shoe is not considered usable in Yontif and may not be sent. Rabbi Yehuda says, Aflay min alavan. You may also not send white shoes, meaning leather shoes that have not yet been blackened, because they need a kratzman to blacken them before they are worn, and so one wouldn't need to wear them on Yontif one wouldn't wear them on Yontif when blackening is also. In the place where Rabbi Yehuda lived, people didn't wear shoes before they had been blackened. Since being mashchir them, since making them black on Yontif is usher because of tzebeya, so white shoes are not usable on Yontif. Zeh haklal. This is the rule. Kol shani oisim by Yontif mishalchan, I say. Any item that's fit to be used may be sent as a gift in Yontif. Anything that's finished and doesn't require malacha to make it fit for use may be sent in Yontif, even if it's used only for weekdays. For example, tefillin, which isn't worn on Yontif. We learned in the previous Mishnah that Beis Hillel allow sending live animals on Yantif, even though it's not fit to be used as is, but requires shchita and cooking. That kula, however, applies only to something that can be used in Yantif itself. In the case of items that will not be used in Yantif, such as tefillin, the act of sending is just to be mesameach on Yantif, only if it's a finished product. Otherwise, it's not going to be a chelik of this Simchas Yantif.